The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, July 7th, and I am Caroline Bailey, a Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to the fourth session of our LTSS Maryland Lunch and Learn series. Today's session is called Putting It All Together, a look at a provider's transition plan. On today's session, we have Amber Rose from Benedictine Adult Services presenting. We're also pleased to have Patricia Sostoki, Rhonda Workman, Robert White, and Linda Yale from the DDA to be available to answer questions. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar, by computer and by phone. If you're having trouble hearing, you may try switching by clicking the appropriate button on the webinar panel. There is one handout for this webinar, which can be found in the handout section of your control panel. We will also be taking breaks to answer questions throughout the presentation, so please enter any questions you may have into the question box on your webinar panel. The presentation will be recorded and will be available on DDA's LTSS Maryland webpage. Now I'd like to introduce Andrea Jones, the Director of Provider Services for DDA's Eastern Shore Regional Office, who will be giving an overview of our presenter.
Hi, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Our speaker today has been with the Benedictine for 6.5 years now. She has worked as a direct support professional, a program coordinator, and a program manager, and now quality assurance specialist. Let's welcome her now, Amber.
Hello, everyone. Thank you guys for all joining. I'm really excited to be able to share some information with you guys today about transition plans. Just real quick, for those who aren't familiar with Benedictine, I want to go over a quick overview of our services. And this, of course, greatly impacted our transition planning process. We have 18 group homes. We also provide personal supports and supported living. We have an array of meaningful day services. We provide respite. We provide services under the family support waiver, and we also act as an organized healthcare delivery system for certain services. So a big tip here would be to list out every service that you provide or even intend to get licensed to provide. It'll definitely help you when you start to think about those overall structures and the service tracking that's needed. To give a quick background, Benedictine had about 3 months to transition, so we were certainly in crunch mode, but with really good planning and great assistance from our Eastern Shore Regional Office, a few of them are on the call, they were part of the DDA team that really helped set us up for success. And currently we're working through lots of processes and workflow modifications, and we're continuing just to see how different organizational areas work together. Next slide. So the objective for today is obviously for you guys to have the opportunity to learn about what goes into the transition plan. So I'm going to go over the brainstorm sessions, team composition, and the transition plan itself and monitoring. Throughout each of these sections, I will go over examples pulled right from our transition planning documents. Next slide. This first section is the brainstorm session. So I'm going to outline the project management framework, our project charter, and the process components. Next slide. Personally, I looked at this like any other project. So the 5 life cycle steps of a project, and if you know anything else like Agile, Lean, Scrum, most of those frameworks and methodologies are all like loosely variations of this basic framework. So it acts like a skeleton. So a tip here is that before you begin even brainstorming, select your framework. This is going to help keep things organized and help everyone kind of focus and think deeply into specific phases and components of that process. Next slide. This is actually an example. Again, we were in a crunch mode of 3 months, so some of those frameworks are combined. I would strongly advise against this. Having each phase on its own is important, and it will provide you with more time and opportunity to find solutions and test solutions and workflows. But if you look at this, you'll see that we have our initiation and planning phase together. That includes things like the project charter, defining all the roles and responsibilities, finalizing the project plan. That second phase of execution, that's allocating those resources that are needed, completing the actual project plan, and having those regular meetings. And then, of course, we have our control and closure. So tracking all those project areas and gathering all that feedback and documenting your lessons learned. Next slide. Once you have your framework identified for your project management pieces, you have your project charter, you get a little bit more specific here. So in this example, and this is straight from ours, our key areas were the project goal, our scope, deliverables, risk and issues, assumptions and dependencies, our milestones, and our projected project team. And this really just listed all the areas that would be impacted. It gives a starting point in the defining piece of that planning and initiating that LTSS transition, and it helps from, get to the big picture and then be able to drill into details. So in this example, you see, for instance, we have our scope, which was our process components: pre-planning, PCP, the approval process, service tracking, billing authorization, billing input, billing reconciliation, and reporting. So this piece is just kind of getting all those big chunks of information out there on paper. So next, we're going to look deeply at the current and projected needs using that scope and the process components. Next slide. We actually took these straight from early adopter groups. I think there was like a webinar or something we picked this up from an early adopter. But out of those process components, we kind of packaged them into these 5 areas: pre-PCP, PCP, post-PCP, tracking against our billing authorizations, and then that billing input, of course, to seek reimbursement. So all of our milestones and any task or responsibilities always went back to one of these categories. Again, it just helped keep things super organized and focused. Next slide. This is a huge tip, and that is for your project team to list your current process in each of those areas. It will help you find, hopefully, all of your gaps. So when we did this, we found out that we had plenty of current gaps. For example, we knew that in our PCP process, we needed an LTSS master tracking list. We needed individual checklists. We needed formal service guides, and we needed redundancy in our PCP approval process within LTSS. We also realized that we had plenty of future gaps, and some examples of those were LTSS role configurations. We had to track in a different way against our billing authorizations. We had to revamp our documentation training for DSPs, and our entire billing process had to be revamped. We were doing monthly billing with prospective payment to weekly and fee for service. So different model, completely different workflow. And you may find it helpful to run a more formal gap analysis, your current transition and future state, or a SWOT, whatever your organization can do to find those performance gaps. Next slide. So here's some general tips for the brainstorming sessions. First is to focus on those overall needs and try not to get wrapped up into the, well, who's going to do that during the brainstorming. You can worry about barriers like people, money, time afterwards. You don't really want to block your creativity with barriers at this stage. Overall needs from the big picture to the small details will happen. And if you start with that larger framework that you're going to operate within, your overall project charter, that specific project components, and finding all those gaps, you'll be on a good path. Next is transparency. This process requires pretty much everyone involved to be pretty open about things that may have been shielded before. And I'll give you a quick example. Our PCPs are run by program coordinators and case coordinators. That whole process and the workflow was pretty much behind a curtain. But now any person on a team can check our live master tracking list and see where a PCP is. So anyone can check on authorizations and what's happening. And that's needed for finance, the program analyst, etc. And everyone can do that without having to send a bunch of emails or make a bunch of phone calls, which of course leads to a lag in communication. And the last bit is to not be dismissive of ideas. Now, of course, that does not mean all ideas are going to make it or even be useful in practice, but you never know how things are going to interact for your organization until you're actually in LTSS. For us, everything got written down and it was all given the same weight until it was time to finalize that transition plan. Also, being open can sometimes help with people who usually don't speak up to actually speak up and feel comfortable because they know that ideas aren't being shut down at this point. And it'll be really important for the facilitator of those sessions to be open and clear about that expectation. Next slide. So this is just an example of the first page of our brainstorm document. So of course, again, after listing your framework phases and your charter table, you're going to want to jump into the ideas that everyone comes up with. Our initial brainstorm document was about 8 or 9 pages. Like I said, it just had everyone's ideas and thoughts outlined under each of those component areas. Next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiana. At this time, we do not have any questions in the question box, so I will turn it back over to Amber to continue with the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Next slide. So next up is that team composition, and this is obviously an important factor. Your brainstorming for the LTSS transition plan will be successful if you include all the right people. Next slide. My biggest tip today is going to be to have an LTSS transition coordinator or manager or lead specialist, whatever you want to name it in title. It would be someone who is that one contact person for all things LTSS. And they're going to have to branch between the internal and external needs, but they'll be able to pull all those puzzle pieces together. So this person should have moderate level of business insight, full knowledge of the PCP process, generally positive relationships within the organization, be open to feedback and criticisms and rants. This person will become the LTSS therapist. They have to be extremely communicative and organized, and probably a self-starter would be good in this. They're going to have to solve problems, but also find problems. So they're going to need to poke and seek out holes. Now, depending on your timeline, this person will need a lot of time per week and resources to be a part of every meeting that involves LTSS. That's going to include vendor meetings, trainings, department meetings, DDA webinars, peer groups, etc. For Benedictine, I attended every vendor and demo meeting, even if it was kind of outside of my scope, but just to take notes. Every internal department meeting that had LTSS on the agenda, mostly to listen and take down questions and concerns. I set up meetings with different program personnel. I was the main contact with DDA, and I was CC'd on every external email related to anything LTSS. So this person is going to be the absorber of a lot of information, and they're going to be able to communicate and then organize it all back to that larger team. Next slide. The next piece of importance is that that key person in that LTSS transition role is going to have to create a team-oriented process. A lot of times groups are mislabeled as teams. Groups are just a collection of individuals. They might have their own goals, their own specializations, and they can be brought together in formal work groups to just quickly solve a problem or work towards fixing a workflow or a process. Next slide. But we want to look at that team, and that is, a group of people committed to that common goal or purpose and each other. So the key part here is that everyone has to know that they're interdependent and that the responsibility of the output is shared across the team. Now, we probably all know what that looks like, but it's important to be impressed upon every team member that it is a collective achievement, and that, individual success means nothing without the overall success of the team. I do think that making that clear reduces finger pointing, blaming, not my job, not my problem-ing. So I'll give you guys an example. We had to revise like 70 plus plans in 30 days. And out of that, probably a handful, maybe like 5 or 6 got missed in the shuffle. But when that happened, no one pointed fingers at anyone, because we knew we had 4 different groups reviewing information. Everyone was involved. Everything was transparent. And so that mistake was a collective team mistake. We knew that the responsibility was on the entire team. So that made finding a solution so much faster. We got to skip the who's to blame game, which is time consuming and ultimately useless. So to maintain this in our current process, we have at least 3 reviewers from different areas looking over a plan before it's approved. Next slide. The next piece is the actual team composition. So just make sure that, each person has a distinct role in the current or the future process. They have to have a good general understanding of internal and external workflows and those DDA requirements. This may require people to increase their business insight. In an example on this one, we actually use service guides. This was suggested by early adopters to increase the knowledge around service configuration and limitations. These were created mostly by our day services team with coordinator input, and we of course modified them along the way. The team must also possess diverse team characteristics. For example, our program analyst thinks of literally everything under the sun. So that leads to increased accuracy in planning and problem solving. And we also have a services director who plays devil's advocate, and that leads to efficiency, making sure our solutions are good solutions, not just a solution. So everyone in that team should know that, people may need to be more aligned with their strengths and knowledge base, and that roles, responsibilities, and expectations will likely change. Next slide.
Okay, hi everyone. We have one question. For the provider staff that you selected for the LTSS transition coordinator, do you see this person staying as the LTSS coordinator forever?
So that person's me. I am also the QA specialist for our adult services. So it is a good chunk of my position, and I'm still in there. I'm in the mix. I have all that information that kind of was collaborated across different areas. So I'm still pulled into meetings for problem solving and to figure things out. I do think that they're going to be a long-term resource just because of the amount of information they'll have.
Okay, we have another question. It's two parts. So I'll read the first part. How did you keep track of who had reviewed the plan and approved it from different areas?
Okay, so for that first part, I mentioned that we have a live tracking checklist. So for instance, a program coordinator might see the plan first. They'll go in and review and make their notes within that checklist, and then finance might go in after that and look at it, and then the program goes in. So we kind of all have our notes and the reviews just live, able for people to click in. And we use Google Docs for that as the live monitoring.
Okay, and then as a follow-up, they wanted to know, was that included in the PCP master tracking list?
Yes, we actually keep a link. So our PCP master tracking list has every person supported, their anniversary date, whether their plan is up to date. And then we have a link to that individual checklist within that. And again, that's all in our Google Doc.
Okay. The next question, what 3 areas were reviewed in your PCP?
The areas reviewed. We have more than 3. I think our checklist has like 9 or 10 checklist points. And I mean, it's everything from the name being spelled right to the right address. That was a huge thing, making sure your provider MA numbers are accurate on the plan, making sure the scope has the ratio. It's a lot. And I can share that. I know I shared it with one of our peer groups, our individual checklist that has the LTSS checklist in there.
Okay. The next question is another 2-part question. So the first part, can you explain more who the 3 different reviewers are looking at the plans and what their roles are?
Mm-hmm. So the coordinator obviously is looking to make sure that the goals are stated correctly, that the addresses are correct, and those components are there, the ratios, the units. They do that. Finance is looking specifically at units, making sure the service address is correct, and just making sure there's no issues so that when they go to reimburse, there's 0 problems. The program, they look at it for pretty much everything the coordinator does, but also to ensure that they can actually provide that service and making sure that we're not, putting in anything that they're not going to be able to live up to. So each person's kind of looking at it from their different scope, but overall everyone's kind of looking at the same information.
Okay, and then the second part, can you describe who are the people on the project team?
Mm-hmm. So our project team, I have that list just on our project charter, but we have finance, a lot of people from finance, obviously, as you can imagine, every single program coordinator and case coordinator, the frontline supervisors were a part of it, all of the directors, our adult services director, and then within those, there might have been smaller groups or teams, but those were like the major categories to kind of get everything rolling.
Okay, we do not have any more questions, so you can continue with the presentation.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so next is the actual transition plan and that monitoring process. Again, I'm going to give you guys examples straight from our finalized project plan. Next slide. So after considering your larger frameworks, you go into your charter, you decide on what your plan components are going to be, then your team composition and considerations for the transition plan, you're on to actually creating the actual plan. So I'm going to go through each section and provide, again, those specific examples that we put under each of those sections. Next. That first section was our project overview. It was pulled from our charter, and then we added a few things if we needed to. So again, that's your goal, your scope, deliverables, those milestones, any risk, assumptions, and listing out your project team. Next slide. Next, we have our risk section that was a part of that. We kind of flushed those out in the actual plan. So this is an example. We have plenty of risk, but for this one, we were worried about our DSP training and support. We were in crunch mode. So we wanted to make sure that we had time to simplify and streamline the process for DSPs, make sure that they knew how they were supposed to be documenting. We wanted to have a pilot group to start it. And from an early adopter, they suggested budgeting 1 hour of one-to-one support for each staff person per week. So then we wanted to say how we would address that risk. So that involved meeting with frontline supervisors and feedback from frontline staff from that pilot group to identify the training needs that would be required for the success of DSPs. Now, it is important that your risks are identified based on information and not just fear. You could probably have a really long list if you did that. Our risks were related to direct key suggestions from early adopters, DDA webinars, or historical information that we had. Next slide. You'll also have your assumptions area. So this was based on early adopters who stated that they hired new staff or reconfigured job duties completely. So our assumption was having the necessary budget for our billing system components to automate a little bit more and or for necessary administrative roles that could not be folded into a current role. Next slide. And then the next section was our project organization. We had our project meetings, our project status updates, and our external personnel and contacts. For the project status updates, that obviously is going to be a decision to make. For us, every 10 business days, the core project team would receive a project update document. So I would call around and collect information from everyone, and whatever notes and things that I collected, I would put into the actual update. That ended up being 6 project status updates for us. And then for the external personnel and contacts, so we just made sure that we put in the plan that this was an uncontrollable factor. There's things you have control over, things you don't. And we knew that we would need to budget time associated with corresponding with those external people like vendors, DDA, CCSs, families and teams, community employers, whoever else. Just being mindful of that, even though we were in crunch mode. And it's important to outline all of those uncontrollable factors. The LTSS contact person can help remind people and help them place their urgency in the right place. And that's just important because, people might freak out, they haven't heard back from a vendor, but you can't control that. So placing all that energy in the right place. Next slide. This is the next section. It was the project startup and the schedule management. So some of these sections were pulled from other project plans and morphed with areas that were critical for this specific project. And this includes the project milestone lifecycle. And each of those were broken down into recommend, procure and create, pilot, and then the implementation, our schedule estimates, and then our schedule table. Next slide. So this is an example of our milestones and schedule management. As you can see, that top part was just about approving the project plan, joining groups, communicating. And then we had one of our process areas, which was implementing the new billing system. So under recommend, we have meet with all our vendor options by a specific date. For the procure and create, we needed to select a vendor, work with that person from the vendor to schedule our training and configuration. We needed to do a pilot, and then we, of course, had to implement, and we went all in on April 1st. Next slide. I don't know how big or small that actually looks to you all, but we did have a Gantt chart, and you can do whatever timeline charts or visualizations. You can place it on a viewable calendar with each milestone and its deadline date. Just some type of visualization. It really helps people see that overall process, and then the progress when doing the project updates will be useful for any part of the team. It's also a quick reference tool as well during the project timeline, and it's helpful in realigning people and letting them know that there is an end and that you're nearing it. So in this example, you can see that many things overlapped, and that, again, we were in that 3-month time crunch. So the sooner you get your plan together, the sooner you can begin executing, which means you'll have more time to plan space in between those major milestones before full implementation. Next slide. So this is an example of the actual update sheet. So at the top, again, you see that billing system piece I just went over. Underneath of that, I put the notes and considerations. So that actually pulled from our brainstorming sessions and what was really important to remember to do within those. And then underneath of that, we of course have our updates. And you want to have as much information in here as possible. Like even in that notes and considerations section, I put everything from the brainstorm sessions. And if we didn't need to do something, I just did a strike through, because sometimes we would realize, oh wait, we do actually have to do that. And we would go back and just remember that. Make sure that you're giving digestible chunks in the updates to the overall team for whoever's in charge of that. Enough details for everyone to kind of understand what's going on. Of course, there's more detail involved, but you can see in that bottom updates section, it's kind of, just quick bits of information on where we were for that piece. Next slide. And my final tips are live documents. If you're running on paper systems or, Word docs that have to be sent and updated and then saved and sent again, get into the digital mix. It's going to speed up your communication and people's access to information, which is going to be extremely important. All DSATs, PCPs, billing reconciliations, EDA, anything related to LTSS, start putting them in folders, getting all the files organized. Another suggestion is a communication chart. So we had one, and it listed each person that would be or need to be communicated with under each project area. So billing system, service tracking, person-centered plans, all broken down. And we put in some gatekeepers, right? So between internal and external contacts. You don't want every single person on your project team emailing one person at DDA. You should have all of that information kind of pulled together before you start sending out external communication. A team charter, that's a suggestion. It provides profiles of the team and skills. That's really useful if you're pulling in people on your project team who don't actually know each other very well or aren't used to working with each other. And of course, be experimental. It's okay if something doesn't work perfectly. It isn't a failure. Some bandages where there should be stitches may be okay until you find that long-term solution. And finally, patience. So even as the LTSS transition coordinator, there's just so many things that specific areas deal with on a day-to-day basis that I just don't know about. And it complicates the workflows and it complicates reaching those target goals and dates. So a problem that may appear simple may have 4 to 5 additional layers that cross through different departments. So gathering information before making those decisions or drumming up solutions is super important, and that's going to take a lot of patience to gather that information before making decisions. And that's why you have to have that key person, and they have to be provided that time and the resources to do so. Next slide.
Hi, okay, so we do have a few questions. Amber Will you be sharing your LTSS checklist during or after the session?
Yeah, I can, whoever I need to send it to, I can send it to get it distributed.
Okay. And then the next question, would you consider sharing a copy of a team charter?
Yes, I think I have one. If not, I have a template of one.
This next question would be for DDA leadership to answer. And the question is, can a new DDA provider start using LTSS to bill for residential services for their individuals?
Hello, good afternoon. This is Robert White, Director of Administrative Services for DDA. And just for clarity, the question is regarding new DDA providers, meaning providers who are not currently providing services, and whether or not, once they're going through the process, they can start out in LTSS. What I can tell you is that we've been discussing this internally as a team, and more information on that will be forthcoming.
Okay, thank you. And then there's one more question for Amber. Do you use collaboration software for your checklist?
We just use Google Docs. We don't use anything else. I know, Slack or Trello or things like that might be useful as well for project management and long-term solutions.
Okay, thank you. There are no more questions in the question box, so I will turn it over to Caroline for closing remarks.
Appreciate that, Kiana. And thank you to Amber for presenting this information, and to our DDA staff who helped answer some questions today. This concludes our final LTSS Maryland Lunch and Learn session. On behalf of the Developmental Disabilities Administration, we thank you for your participation and hope you have a wonderful day.